Are you struggling with out of focus shots, under or overexposed footage? Then you're in luck, because today we're going to talk about the best camera monitor that you can get in 2023 on a budget. Why it's the best? We're going to talk about in a second. But first, do you even have a use for an external camera monitor? And when do you absolutely need one? Now, the most obvious reason would be if you don't have a flip out screen, like maybe you're shooting on an older DSLR, then you'll struggle to find this feature even on professional cameras like Canon's 1DX. And some companies were gatekeeping this feature even as recently as 2 years ago on their €2,000 cameras. And yes, I'm looking at you, Sony, and all of the poor A7 III users out there. Then if you're a one-man film crew and want to set up an A-roll shot with the camera being even 2 meters away, then even that flip-out screen becomes basically useless. And you'll have to rely on the autofocus to do what it should, but you can't even check things like exposure, for example. Personally, I always prefer to use manual focus for most of my shots. Yes, partly because I am using a GH5 with an adapted lens, but mostly it's because I want to control what is actually in focus, and for that you want to do it manually. But I've always struggled to actually tell what is in focus on that tiny camera screen, and even with amazing features in the GH5 like focus peaking, well, it did help somewhat, but the tiny screen is just a bit cumbersome in my opinion. Now, to imagine not having focus peaking at all, or even a worse screen that isn't bright enough or has bad pixel density, would make autofocusing much more cumbersome, if not actually impossible sometimes if you're outside in broad daylight, for example. So if you're affected by this, I mean, you'll probably know. Then when I got to film for a production company using the small HD 5-inch monitor, I pretty much instantly knew I needed one if I want to keep relying on manual focus the way I am. The problem is, small HD monitors can cost a lot of money, and the cheapest runs you about $330 to €350. The Desview R5II, on the other hand, is coming at a much less eye-watering price of around €200 MSRP, but you'll often find it for even less than that, around €170 to €180. And if you're willing to get it from China directly, then it costs you €120 with VAT included, if you're willing to wait a month or two until it arrives. When taking it out of the box, the first thing I noticed is that the monitor is pretty light for its size, coming in at only 200 grams. The build quality does feel a bit plasticky. I wouldn't say it feels cheap, but it also doesn't scream high quality either, especially if you're used to professional photography gear. It comes with a few accessories. You do get a cold shoe mount adapter, so you can instantly attach it to your handle or camera, a micro HDMI, a mini HDMI cable, and a microfiber cleaning cloth. Also, you get a USB stick and a super cheap plastic visor, and an additional hood that you can attach with Velcro. Now, this hood does feel pretty cheap, even though it does the job when you really need it, but it doesn't really entice any excitement using it. Now, what does entice excitement is the panel of this monitor. It's a 5.5-inch IPS screen with a 1080p resolution, which is really good for its size, giving it a pixel density of 401 pixels per inch. It supports 4K through both of its HDMI 1.4 ports, with a pass-through, which you don't usually see in this price class. That means you can actually keep using this monitor in even more professional environments when you need, for example, a transmitter and a second monitor for the director, as long as you don't need SDI. While the brightness at 800 nits isn't anything to brag about, it does barely enable it to display HDR, at least somewhat, since a good HDR experience actually needs at least 1000 nits. But for studio use, the brightness is totally acceptable, especially considering the price point and the alternatives we're going to look at in a minute. Then again, if you're shooting mostly outside and in broad daylight, the 800 nits won't really cut it, and I would suggest you to look at the bigger brother of the R5II, the R6, which boasts a class-leading brightness of 2800 nits, at a price point of usually about $100 more. Desview lists a realistic contrast ratio of about 1000 to 1, and because they use an IPS panel, it has really good viewing angles, which is definitely nice. It's also pretty color accurate. It can use both Sony NP-F and Canon LPE6 batteries, which I really like to see, and I wish more manufacturers of camera accessories would give us the option to choose our battery type this way. It can also be powered by a DC in port on the side in between the aforementioned HDMI ports, taking in a voltage of 7 to 24 volts if you choose to power it with a plug or even a V-mount battery. Taking a look around the chassis, we also find an 8-volt DC out on the bottom, a 3.5mm stereo headphone jack, a 1/4-inch thread, and a USB port, which we'll get into later. On the right side you find a second 1/4-inch thread to attach the monitor from the side, and finally on the top you have the power button. Would have wished to see another 1/4-inch thread here for rigging this monitor out, but if you're planning to rig this out for first AC, you'd probably still need a cage for that, even if we had that third thread. I guess we can't have everything, but where it does have pretty much everything is the tools that Desview builds into their monitors, because for less than $200, you're not just getting a good 5.5-inch monitor, but also every exposure tool that you could probably wish for, like false color, fully customizable zebras, brightness and RGB histogram, luminance and RGB waveforms, and vector scope. But that's not it. Want to film anamorphic? No problem, because this monitor has anamorphic D-squeeze, aiming for a certain aspect ratio and want markers? Check. Need grid lines to frame up your shots better? Check. Want to stabilize in post without the crop factor affecting your framing? Or are you filming reels and TikToks and want to avoid things being positioned in a certain area? Safe Markers got your back there. Filming an HLG or log and want to actually see how it's going to look after applying the grade, or even just to see if your exposure is correct. Remember the USB stick we talked about? That is for importing your very own LUTs and color corrections to preview them live. But keep in mind, these will not be baked into the footage, which I actually personally like more. If you're familiar with modern Lumix cameras, they already come with absolutely insane exposure tools and things like anamorphic D-squeeze, for example, and generally just videography tools that you'll usually only find on much more expensive, sometimes only cinema cameras that cost like 5 times the price of these. So in a way, I was already quite spoiled with a lot of these features like focus peaking, waveforms, open gate modes, and D-squeeze factors. So how did it revolutionize my workflow then so much if I already had so many of these features available? Now, the biggest reason is false color. With this, the days of over or underexposing your image, or even a part of your image, because you're only relying on the exposure meter of your camera, are gone. And you can forget about exposure metering, because false color kind of does it all. And while it might be personal preference, I do prefer to use it over things like histogram and even over things like waveforms, because I find it much easier and especially quicker to read and tell what's properly exposed and what isn't. What basically makes or breaks the experience with these cheaper monitors oftentimes is the operability of them. Because in this case, you get an amazing responsive touchscreen for a price where usually other monitors only have very cumbersome button layouts. And even if they have touch, the implementation is often so scuffed and unresponsive that it's generally just a nuisance to use. Being able to easily pinch zoom, adjust the monitor's brightness or your headphones volume by just swiping on the left or right side of the screen respectively, and having a very well laid out menu that is easy to navigate thanks to the touchscreen, ensures that you will actually use the features built in because they're so easy to access, often eliminating the need to search through more cluttered menus on your camera, for example, or even just leaving more function buttons free because you don't need them for exposure anymore. Because nothing is perfect, this monitor also has some drawbacks. First thing that I noticed is it takes a bit too long to turn on for my taste, especially after it arrived. It threw me off a bit because I asked myself if it's broken or something, because I just didn't hold the power button for long enough, and you need like 3 to 4 seconds to turn this monitor on, and it doesn't turn on when you press the power button, rather when you release it, so you do have to get a bit used to that. It also sips quite a lot of power, and with a small NP F550 2900 mAh battery, I only got around 2 hours of runtime at 50% brightness. So if you're using 550s or E6 batteries, you might be a bit disappointed with the runtime, especially outside in broad daylight when you have to crank the brightness up. Or if you have older batteries, that's why I would recommend using the bigger NP F970 batteries, especially if you want to power other devices off of the monitor and its battery. If not, you can comfortably power this thing with a 970 for a pretty much half a shooting day, probably, maybe even a full one, depending on the brightness. Now, it also does have a little bit of HDMI input lag. I made sure it's not the GH5, so I tested it with the A7 III as well. It's definitely miles better than some of the cheaper monitors, but it's still there, so just be aware of that. With that said, let's look at some of the competitors in this price range. The Portkeys PT5II and PT6 are also very popular choices. The good thing is they have DCI-P3 calibration, and the only downside again is that the P5II is only 600 nits, so 200 nits less than the Desview. So if it's roughly the same price point, I'll have to pass again unless you desperately need the cheapest, brightest monitor for mainly outdoor use. Then maybe the PT6 could be a viable option for you. For about 250 to 280 euros, you can get the aforementioned bigger brother of the Desview R5II, the R6. boasting a class-leading brightness of 2800 nits, easily beating the PT6, even though it's quite a bit more expensive. But purely spec-wise, the R6 kind of takes away the crown here. And the R5II impresses with its amazing price-to-performance ratio compared to these much more expensive or even sometimes cheaper options, to be honest. Sadly, most other monitors I looked at when writing this review, between like 100 euros to 200 euros, are either noticeably dimmer at like 450 to 500 nits, or don't have good touchscreens or no touchscreens at all. So at that point, honestly, it comes down to the price. If the Desview is around 200 euros in your region, I think sacrificing some features might be a worth trade-off for you, but personally I would still try to save up, especially if the price difference is only about like 50 bucks. All in all, the Desview R5II gets my clear recommendation because the argument that it's the best monitor in its price class, in my opinion, still stands, with all of the amazing features for exposing, framing, and a really good touchscreen that you're getting, which you usually don't see in this price range. Also good accurate colors and plenty of accessories. Just keep in mind that it doesn't come with batteries.